Hi, you're watching BloombergQuint. We're coming to you from the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, the 50th one at that, from right outside the Congress Center. I have with me an important China voice, Zhu Ning, Associate Dean of the National Institute of Financial Research. Now, Professor Zhu is well known for his commentary on China, including on the China reform process, and I'm hoping he will give us some insights on what the next 10 years holds for the Chinese economy, given that it's such an important driver of global growth. Professor Zhu, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Nice to be here.
Last year the New York Times quoted you as saying that the trade war is a good thing because you were hoping that it would actually push China on the road of, the right kind of reforms. We've had, a year and more of standoff now between the U.S. and China, a phase one deal, but not many people are very impressed by it. What do you make of what that year and a half has brought?
Well, first of all, I want to make it clear. I think I was actually meaning the trade negotiation is a good thing to China.
Okay.
I mean, the process, not necessarily
yes, of course, I
the result.
That, yes.
And the second, I think, it is gradually panning out that China is pushing forward some of the reforms which are, I think, healthy to China's own economic growth, with such as environmental protection, such as unleashing more resources from the market, such as
IPR.
Exactly, IP protection. So I think that is a healthy dose of messages for China, which is, partly being motivated by the negotiation along with the U.S. and maybe the rest of the world. And finally, I think I want to emphasize that there is, despite the slowdown in the economy, there's still a great deal of momentum in China's economy and resilience as long as we're seeing the reform, I guess, more market-based reform, keeping pushing forward in China.
So you're also of the opinion, as many other economists are, that the trade war hasn't substantially impacted China's economy. We do know for a fact that while exports to the U.S. may have declined, overall exports in China have come down very marginally. And you're saying it hasn't had as much of a domestic impact either?
Not at the moment. I don't think the direct impact to the GDP is something that we should be focusing on when we're talking about the impact of U.S.-China trade tension. I think we have to look beyond that. One is on the technological transfer and technological collaboration area. Mm-hmm. We do see a big drop, if not a slowdown, in the collaboration between China and the rest of the world.
Sure.
This could have very long-term impact on China's R&D and economy. Another big point is just the sentiment, both in the financial market and in the entrepreneurial spirit. About, if there is going to be ongoing tension between China and the U.S., should I keep my investment in China? Should I do something diversifying my risks? And finally, I think people are talking a lot about the increasing uncertainty with the global supply chain. Are we going to have the entire supply chain within China, or are we going to see a sort of diversification or retreating of part of the operation from China? I think that's going to be a much longer term issue which we have to wait and see.
And in fact, that's already playing out, right? We've seen that those who were planning or working on supply chains that were predominantly focused on China are now picking other countries to maybe diversify their supply chain. And many countries are hoping to become then part of this, shift away from China. What do you make of the phase one deal? Are you encouraged by it? Do you think it's too little? And do you believe there will be a phase two and a phase three?
I think, of course, having a phase one deal is better than having nothing. I think that's definitely true and encouraging.
Sure.
That being said, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty regarding the enforcement, the implementation of the stage one deal. And I guess we won't see anything in the near future, probably not until the completion of the U.S. presidential election towards the later part of this year. But after that, I think two things are really worth watching out for. One is what was the outcome of the presidential election and the U.S. side of the deal. And the other is to what extent China would be making progress towards those areas of reform which will be meeting the expectations of the trade negotiations. So I think it's too early to tell whether we're going to have a phase two or phase three deal. But what's more important is, I guess, one, China is on the right trajectory to further reform. Two is, I think the rest of the world will be still welcoming China to continue its leadership in its not just openness, but also in its momentum to driving the global economy.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about that economic leadership, but before that, 6% growth for 2019. There is now expectation that China will grow just about that. So I was speaking with Professor Fan earlier on. He said 6% is probably where we'll be for the course of the decade. I spoke with Ken Rogoff of Harvard, and he said, in fact, that he's expecting an average 3% from China through the course of the decade. How do you assess this GDP growth number and what the next few years might bring?
I think it's relatively easier to forecast this year's GDP growth number in 2020. I think will be somewhere close to 6%, more likely to be on the downward side, which is just enough for us to complete the doubling GDP per capita within the past decade objective. So I think that's relatively easy. Regarding the longer term prospect, I think there are two things which we have to be very careful. One is the uncertainties, both the geopolitical uncertainties and also we're having a close to pandemics going on in the Wuhan area. We're going to have some sustainable issues with the growth numbers. But I think I will be somewhere in between Professor Fan Gang and Professor Rogoff. I think 3% is probably a little bit too pessimistic, but then I do see China's economy gradually taking the step down, and I don't think we're going to continue the 6% growth in the next decade.
So somewhere between 3 and 6%?
Yeah, I think more like 4 to 5, I think.
More like 4 to 5.
Yeah.
You did bring up the issue of the coronavirus right now, and I know that China is grappling to deal with it. You expect, I mean, this is a slightly more economic way of looking at it, but you do expect that this will hurt this year's growth numbers in some way?
I think based on what things are, I think it probably will for two reasons. One is it is Chinese New Year. It is supposed to be the most joyful, most spending time of the year, but given the constraints on the traveling, I think we're going to see a big dip in those numbers. Two is just pure sentiment. I think it's just giving people the scare. They're not going out as much as they have planned to, and that's going to hurt the economy, at least in the short term.
Sure, we understand that. Along with GDP growth, the question I wanted to ask you was about the rebalancing of the Chinese economy. This has been something we've discussed over the last several years now, the shift away from investment to consumption. Professor Fan was saying that, there might be a resumption of investment next year onwards. We're also seeing China pursue a different investment path through the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is not necessarily pumping it into the domestic economy, but finding new avenues of putting that money to work. I'm curious of how you assess this rebalancing of the economy and the one big issue that continues to weigh on this rebalancing, which is debt in China.
I think you're right on the money. I think we are in the right direction. We're going towards the direction of transforming the growth model and trying to contain the debt which has been accumulated during the past decade. However, I think it's much easier said than done. I think we're going towards the route of deleveraging in the past 3 years, but then we have seen a significant slowdown in the economic growth and also a big drop in the A-shares market back in 2015 and 2018. So I think it's a very delicate balance that the policymaker would have to try to with. And regarding that, I think we have to be looking out for two areas of important messages. One is the overall level of debt for China. I mean, even after the past 3 years of deleveraging, the national level of debt was actually higher now than it was 3 years ago. So we're still being constrained with the debt capacity. The other is, I think more importantly, where do we invest if we were to raise the funding? I think part of the reason why we're having escalating debt is the investment projects, mostly infrastructure investments and housing-related projects, are not generating as healthy cash flow as people have been hoping for. And how do we juggle that with the slowdown of the economy? I think that's the bigger challenge. And regarding Belt and Road, I think we're still working patiently along that direction. I think this is a national strategy. This is a longer-term project. And I think part of the reason why we're probably witnessing a little bit of slowdown in the Belt and Road is the following twofold. One is I think there's still some confusion regarding what China is going to do with the Belt and Road, and hence there are some concerns and reservations with the project. And more on the economic side, I think the slowdown of RMB internationalization and the increasing of the national level of debt is sort of constraining Chinese hands in making bigger investment along the Belt and Road countries. So I think that's a combination of two, which will take some time to resolve over the next few years, maybe over the next decades.
Yeah, the latest data does seem to indicate a minor reduction in investment allocated towards the OBOR project. But I want to go back to the debt issue you raised. What numbers should we be working with, Professor Zhu? Because it's really difficult to tell apart private debt in China from SOE debt or state-owned enterprise debt, and really how difficult this problem is, or how big this problem is, or how scary this problem is. Can you put it in context for us as to why you are so concerned about both the absolute amount of debt and the trajectory?
Right, that's a very good question, and I think it's very important that we keep that in our mind when we talk about China's economy. After all, I think a big part of China's growth came from investment-related projects, and many of the investment were actually made with the borrowing of debt. So, I mean, I think that the overall level of debt is high, but it's not drastic. I mean, we're probably looking at the national level of debt to GDP ratio of 270%-ish to China, which is high relative to most emerging economies, but it's not high compared to Japan, which is like 100 percentage points higher. We're somewhere around where the U.S. was right before the global financial crisis. So I think that's to put things into perspective. I guess what's making China's debt problem unique or more concerning is the following three areas. One is, I mean, we still don't have a very comprehensive or clear idea about how comprehensive or how accurate the national level data were. I mean, this is the data were compiled based on a bottom-up approach, and of course, the local government have every incentive to understating their level of data. So this is one thing that I've been concerned with. The second is in China, a lot of the debt are what we call contingency-based debt. It's was not popping up unless the economy were to slow down, unless some extreme events were to happen, and we're not fully prepared for that incident. Another way is, I think people try to make a big distinction between corporate debt and government debt in China, but we have to be understanding that a big part of the corporation debt in China is actually corporate debt coming from the SOEs, which are closely linked to or backed by local and the central government. So in that regard, if we group all those SOE debt as the government debt, I think that's depicting a very different picture than we're just saying, oh, the corporate debt is the major issue. It's not just that. I think the government debt is somewhat related to that.
Okay, so if you were to keep in mind the debt issues and the resolution of that and how challenging it's going to be, the fact that GDP growth will slow to somewhere between 4 and 5% through the course of this decade, do you believe that there is scope for China to continue to invest in a big way in the domestic economy? There are mixed views out there, and the reason why I ask is because China has been a critical driver of growth for the world, and the slowdown has hurt things like commodities, and we're wondering if there is any chance that might pick up at all.
Personally, I'm not too optimistic with another big wave of investment coming out of China. I think we have to be mindful that China has done a lion's share of its work to stabilize the global economy after the global financial crisis. And partly as a result of that, I think China has been accumulating debt as a result of the not so efficient or not so profitable investment it has made over the course of the past decade. And as a result of that, one is there is not that much room for further monetary easing. I mean, this is not just for China. This is pretty much true for many major economies in the world. And also with the debt accumulating, the fiscal stimulus is also seeing a much smaller room for it to maneuver. So in that regard, I mean, we just don't have as much space to move around with investment as we did a decade ago. And personally, I don't think we should go down that route, because after all, that is a major reason why we're seeing the debt increasing so much in China. I mean, the absolute level of debt, if that's not surprising, the speed by which, the trajectory by which the debt has been accumulating over the past decade is very concerning.
So to wrap this up, how would you see or assess China's economic leadership in the context of a slowing GDP growth, in the context of internal debt issues, in the context of a trade war that's probably hurting business but also sentiment in a big way? Do you think this decade will be as China prominent as the last decade?
Well, I think it will still be very China prominent. I mean, Yes, we're probably going to grow at a slower pace, but the size of the economy is more than twice as big as it was,
yes.
right? So with that, and also I think China is trying to push very hard in sustainable growth, in green growth, in high quality growth, and also we're trying very hard with the R&D, with the intellectual property rights protection. I think China is having more of its own research, its own brand, its own distribution center. So I think the vast majority of the middle income class, I think the consumption power, the sheer consumption power that's coming out of that, I think is good enough to propel China's economy to go on for the next decade. Maybe not as fast as before, but still I think the resilience and the sustainability is what I look at. And on top of that, I think there are two things I want to just mention briefly. One is China's regional influence. I think it's not just China by itself, but China and the countries around China. I think we're working more closely now than before in many areas, not just confined to the economy. Two is, I think China is not just an economy. China is sort of a symbol for the emerging economy. So I think there are many emerging economies which are trying to take the China path and trying to grow their own economy. So in that regard, it's not just one country, it's more of a growth model. Whether that is sustainable for 5 decades, we can ask that question, but at least for the starters, we have a lot of hope and potential.
In spite of what's going on in Hong Kong?
Yes, in spite of what's going on in Hong Kong.
All right, Professor Zhu, thank you so much for speaking with us
Always a
on
pleasure.
BloombergQuint. Thank you for your time here in Dallas.
Thank you very much.